And before we jump into our conversation, one of the things I wanted to do is really quickly kind of ground ourselves with some historical perspective on metrics. And so what I've noticed recently is we tend to have only a handful of jobs we hire metrics to do. So if you break apart everything we've gone over this morning, each of those individual, usually three-letter acronyms tell us only a handful of things. But these are the things we asked metrics to do. We asked them to tell us if there are people where our ads are running. We ask if they are the right people. We ask if those people are actually seeing our ads. We ask, are they interacting with my ad? Are they influenced by my ad? And are they taking action based on my ad? Every metric we listed basically you could draw a line to one of these core functions. But these metrics don't just kind of get invented for fun. They have a very specific, almost tragic lifetime. We invent metrics because we need them. Those questions we want to answer can't be answered for some new venue that people care about. A venue is introduced, so the internet's born. People start to visit that venue. It becomes the shiny object. But once people are there, we want to talk to them because they're spending their time and their attention there, and that's where we want to get in front of. The new metric emerges to justify spend on that metric. So once it's not enough just that there are people there, you're going to continue to spend money. People want to see it's accountable. You exit the shiny object phase. If that metric is successful, it becomes an industry. Companies devoted specifically to that metric. Businesses are born just to deliver on that metric. And finally, the last tragic step, the metric is optimized. And optimized, you could also substitute hacked, gamed, or manipulated, which is when a metric becomes a currency, it becomes really easy to transact in that metric, but it becomes really easy to short circuit that metric and leads you to a lot of bad places. And this has happened for every venue we've seen. My favorite example is just the original internet. People started using Prodigy and AOL as dial-up. The internet users started to occur. We decided we needed ads in front of them. We decided, hey, we don't have clicks, we don't have cookies yet. How are we going to measure these? We only care about page views. But there was no standard for that. So we had to go and actually have industries that started to come out with Comscore, Quantcast, Alexa, net ratings. And then those page views were optimized. I remember kids in my high school who would install little applications on their desktop that would just visit websites while they slept, and they would get nickels and dimes that were mailed to them through some malicious actors. And you can recognize this anywhere, especially with visitation data. So when mobile apps arrived, we borrowed metrics, and that led to the initial wave of spend, CPI, cost per install. But it didn't work for auto and other things where you actually had physical locations. So visits started to emerge as a metric which justified that spend. It grew into an industry. We started to have multiple players who started to come in and lots of different ways that we could optimize against it. And now we're coming into that last step. And what Brian and I want to talk about today, especially because he's the one who's going to tell me whether or not we're going to fail or not, is do we end up in over-optimization or do we get led to intelligence?
A lot of the last 2 years for us, and I think for a lot of people, has been just rethinking how we think about KPIs. The KPIs don't buy the cars, right? It's the audiences that buy the cars. And a lot of our takeaway has been where our time and energy really needs to be is not trying to identify the thing we want to get, but to spend more time thinking about how we're going to get it. So a lot of the last years has been shifting that paradigm of spending all of our time just thinking about KPIs and how we optimize it, to thinking about who are the people we need to talk to, what do we know about them, what additional intelligence can we gather on them. And when you start to think of it that way, suddenly location data is a lot more interesting, it's a lot more meaningful. It's not just the KPI you plug into the optimization system and see what happens. It becomes a source for insight on who are your customers, who are your competitive customers, how can location data add to what you know about them and help you better prioritize who you should be reaching. And so a lot of, I think the last 2 years for us has been going from KPIs that matter to, you know what, maybe KPIs don't matter, at least not the way we traditionally talked about them.
And if you are trying to basically say KPIs don't matter anymore, does that leave you kind of adrift at sea with no mechanisms for optimizations?
So I think the initial interesting analogy for me in thinking about how location data can add insights to our KPIs is a parallel conversation we've been having about identity resolution. When you're doing any kind of identity resolution, right, you need a truth set. You need something that you're going to compare your graph against, a list of known identities that you can check your ID graph, make sure that you're, optimize it and hold it accountable. And so within the world of KPIs and audiences, I think location data really could be that truth set for us. It gets really interesting when you start to think about what's the role of the OEM site, what's the role of the dealer sites, and you start to layer in audiences to think, look, audience A doesn't perform any actions on the OEM site, but they end up at a dealership. What does that tell us about the consumer journey? What does it tell us about how we should be thinking about those KPIs? Or audience B does a lot of these kinds of traditional KPIs that we used to care about, but doesn't end up at a dealership. It's holding our audiences, our KPIs, everything we're looking at accountable, not to necessarily throw out a website or say something's not important, but to understand better how this consumer journey works and how are we going to get the outcome that we want.
Super Bowl, it makes sense. You're going to drop $2 to $5 million. Let's all sit in a room in kumbaya and talk about big picture ideas. Or you're relaunching a brand and you want to have an entirely new feel. Let's go talk to everybody and spend some time. Or even just beginning of the year planning. But how do you put this into practice on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis?
The biggest change for us is we used to look at it and say, wow, with location data, I could walk into a room and say, hey, we're optimizing to foot traffic, and I increased your foot traffic by 30%. And I just imagined myself like mic dropping out of every meeting. Like I would just say that sentence, and then everyone would cheer, and they would like applaud and give me things like money and stuff. And that's how my life was going to be. But like, there's just no shortcut to get someone into your dealership. We all know what KPI is predictive of foot traffic, even if you've never looked at the data, and that KPI is desire. That is a hard KPI to game. That's the hard part of the job. Just because we have location data doesn't mean we can all of a sudden spike foot traffic, but what we can do is learn more about who we want to talk to. What we can do is get a better understanding of the consumer journey and how our audiences are behaving and start to make smarter decisions that will help us achieve the only KPI that matters, which is desire.
We've always, in the last couple of years, have been so focused on shopping for KPIs, but it was so unrealistic because it was cheating. Coming back to that is you have to instill the discipline in your team, your client relationship, the vendors, you have that partner, into selling them on something that is an accurate expectation of what customer behavior and ideal customer behavior could be like.
Many clients have gotten tired of seeing presentations with hockey stick lines going up in the air, and they look at their own business and they know nothing is changing. It doesn't take long for people to figure that out. Like, we've spiked all these metrics, but I'm still selling the same amount of cars. Clients are refreshed by an approach that says, like, hey, like, we need to understand our audience. We need to understand what we're going to say to them. We need to understand the context of what we're going to say to them, and that's where we need to spend almost all of our energy. Yes, we need to measure things and be held accountable, but we need to do all the work that leads to that to get to that point.
So we shop for KPIs, we got drunk on hockey stick charts, and now we're waking up with a hangover, patting our pockets, making sure our keys and cell phones are there, and what we wanted to do in the first place, and then optimizing to that.
Correct.
Thank you.